The chronological end of the Old Testament Hebrew Bible takes place in the 6th century BCE, that is in the 500s BCE. I say the chronological end of the text is that because that's actually not the latest that our literature comes from. It's just that's the end of the story. What happens basically is that the Jews are taken out of Judea, they're taken into captivity, or at least the upper class is, in Babylon, and then they wait 70 years, and then they're allowed to come back into Judea to rebuild the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, and it's the rebuilding of the temple and the walls of Jerusalem that are narrated in the books Ezra and Nehemiah. But then that's kind of where the story of the Jews, of the Israelites, ends at the end of the 6th century BCE. That's not actually the latest document because, as we'll talk about a little bit later today, the book of Daniel, which claims, of course, to be written in Babylonian captivity, but also by a guy named Daniel who lived in the 6th century, it's actually not written then. It's written around the year 164 BCE. So that's the latest document that we have that's in the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. So there's a difference in the actual timing of the documents and the chronological end of the story. I'll remind you of what we talked about last time with Alexander the Great, just very briefly. Alexander the Great, remember, wanted to set up a one world, a universal empire. He taught a sort of syncretism of religion. He taught a common language, Greek. He set up these Greek cities all around. These things will all be very important for us. And that process that we call is what we call Hellenization. So the Hellenization of the world in that time means that we even call that period Hellenistic Greek, the Hellenistic period, to differentiate it from classical Greek period, say classical Athens in the 6th and 5th century, and then the Greco-Roman period, which will come later with the period of Rome. The reason Hellenism is so important for us is because Alexander, what happened to his empire after he died? After much confusion and fighting among his major generals after his death, Alexander's kingdom ended up being divided up into 4 major empires. For our purposes, only 3 of those really matter. And on your handout, you'll see the names Seleucus and Antiochus and the Seleucids. Seleucus was one of the generals of Alexander, and he ended up getting the part of his empire that had been Babylonia, that is modern-day Iraq, and Syria. And what happens is you'll find over and over again that a man named Seleucus will have a kid named maybe Antiochus, who will have a kid named Seleucus, who will have a kid named Antiochus. The Seleucids was what we call their dynasty, their family name. They tended to use those 2 names, Seleucus and Antiochus, a lot. So you'll see just Seleucus the first, second, third, Antiochus the first, second, third, and fourth. Those 2 names were used quite in their family over and over again. So it gets very confusing in historical literature when it's hard to keep them straight. But that's the reason. His general Ptolemy II got the kingdom of Egypt, which was very, very important because Egypt was one of the wealthiest parts of the ancient world. So Ptolemy II took Egypt and set up his own sort of Greco-Egyptian kingdom there. So when we talk about these things, sometimes you'll hear us talk about the Syrian Empire or the Greco-Syrian Empire or simply the Greek Empire. That's because there was a Greek sort of veneer over what would have been local differences. So you'd have Egyptians speaking ancient Egyptian languages, but the elites in the cities would be speaking Greek. So the elite culture would still be Greek, and the same way in Syria. Ptolemies are easier to keep straight because they tended to all be named Ptolemy. And so they might have a nickname like Ptolemy Philadelphus is a very famous one, but then we give them numbers. So Ptolemy II was the first general who ruled Egypt, and then his descendants would be named 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and so forth. The other empire that was important, but we'll not talk about it too much today, is what was Macedonia and Greece itself, and the general Antigonus Gonatas was the one who took that. And that would be its own sort of area until the Romans defeated the different Greek rulers there and took over Macedonia and Greece. What's important for us, though, is really the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, because if you draw a line separating Syria from Egypt, the line goes right through Palestine. The Jews were kind of caught, therefore, on the border. So Judea at this time was on the border between these two empires, and they were constantly fighting, trying to aggrandize their own kingdoms. The Jews were often, therefore, caught right in the middle. Antiochus IV Epiphanes reigned from 175 to 164 BCE. He's called the fourth, obviously, because he's in the fourth Antiochus. Epiphanes, though, is a sort of nickname, and it means manifest. It's just the Greek word for manifest. But what Antiochus was doing with this name is saying he was claiming divine honors for himself, because what he's saying is, I'm Antiochus, God made manifest among you. This was not that unusual. As I said last time, Alexander had sort of claimed divine honors for himself. He was following the lead of a lot of Eastern monarchs and rulers who would claim to be the descendants of a god and claim to be a god themselves and would receive cult and worship. Antiochus IV, though, was ruling at this time, and he gained control of Judea. At one point, he almost conquered Egypt, as a matter of fact. Again, there were always these battles. But then Rome intervened. Rome was not in control of the Eastern Mediterranean at this time, but they started getting more and more powerful. So Rome came to Egypt, and a Roman general basically said, you've got to withdraw, and forced Antiochus IV to pull out of Egypt. Why did Rome do that? Well, Rome didn't want any other empire in the Mediterranean to get too powerful. So they wanted they didn't want to really control all the eastern part of the Mediterranean at this time. They would have been stretched too thin. But they wanted these two kingdoms to balance each other out. So they weren't particularly for Antiochus IV. They just didn't want him to destroy the Egyptian Ptolemies and him to take over Egypt, because it would make him too powerful. So Rome, though, shows that they have enough power that they can kind of play the referee between different kingdoms, even in the east at this time. While Judea, though, was under Antiochus' control, a lot of Jews tried to figure out, how do you deal with this whole process of Hellenization? In other words, if you want your own kids to get ahead in the world in this time, and you're going to have an elite family yourself in a town, in a city, it makes sense for your kids to get a Greek education. You want your sons, for example, to be able to speak and read and write Greek. Why? Because that's the lingua franca of the elite, of the business and of government and all that sort of thing. It's precisely the way it is now with English around the world. Elite families want their kids to have English education. They want them to be familiar with American culture, and if possible, they'll even send them to a university in the States or to graduate school in the States. And this is partly because there are good universities in the States, but it's also partly because they know that to get ahead, their kids need to use English. They need to become, in some sense, to some extent, Americanized. This is what's going on even in places like Jerusalem at this time. Jerusalem wasn't a huge city, but it was important enough that there were elites there themselves, and so when they responded to this urge of Hellenizing culture to have their kids educated in the gymnasium, remember, so they would themselves get this sort of Greek rhetorical education. In fact, what we'll call, for the purposes, liberals and conservatives in Jerusalem, because there was conflict in Jerusalem at this time over how much Hellenization you should go along with. Apparently, a majority of the priests and the lay nobility supported the Hellenizing group, that is, the Jewish leaders who wanted to bring more Hellenization into Jerusalem itself. The high priest at this time was named Jason. His name is on here. And in 175, he built a gymnasium in Jerusalem. Why did he build a gymnasium in Jerusalem? Well, if you're going to have Greek education, you have to have a gymnasium. He also founded a Greek polis, that is a Greek city structure. And Jason apparently paid Antiochus for the privilege of having Jerusalem recognized as a Greek city. This would have consolidated the power of those Jewish leaders who wanted to press Greek culture more, rather than those Jewish leaders who wanted to hold back on Greek culture. Because if you control the gymnasium and you control the means of education, you actually control the citizenry, because you can't become a citizen of a Greek polis, a Greek city, unless you yourself have Greek education. So sons of people would go to the gymnasium. And notice what this would do also. It would disenfranchise those leading families who didn't want to have their sons Hellenized. So by holding the control of the education, you disenfranchise conservative Jews who are resisting this Greek influence. About this time, apparently, Antiochus offered citizenship status to the Jews, but, and like I said, admission to the gymnasium and the ephebate. Remember the ephebate we talked about, how the boys around the years 18 to 22 or so, around the age that you guys are, you would be enrolled in this sort of quasi-education, quasi-military training club sort of thing of the town. That was the ephebate, and you had to go through that to be a citizen. Jason and his party controlled this, and in fact they renamed Jerusalem Antioch of Jerusalem. There are lots of different cities named Antioch in the ancient world, and were all done in honor of some Antiochus. So Jerusalem was renamed Antioch of Jerusalem. The high priesthood was the main ruler of the Jews at this time. They didn't have a king, and they didn't have a direct governor. So whoever controlled the high priesthood was sort of the political ruler also at this time. But Antiochus was the one who had the privilege of appointing the high priest. Menelaus, another leading Jew, his name's on your handout, seems to have offered Antiochus more money for the priesthood, trying to get it away from Jason, and he couldn't afford it. So in order to pay for his own priesthood, he took gold vessels and instruments out of the temple treasury. And this seems to have caused a riot. Now notice, Jason, is that a good Jewish name? No. That's not a good Jewish name. Menelaus, is that a good Jewish name? No. Jason and Menelaus are both famous Greek names. You have two guys fighting for the high priesthood in Jerusalem, both with Greek names, not traditional Hebrew names, and both of them apparently trying to get in with his Hellenizing process. They get into a big fight. To settle things down in Jerusalem, Antiochus takes control of Jerusalem, and he stationed Syrian troops, that is, these Greco-Syrian troops, in Jerusalem in 167. Now things are heating up. Around this time, changes were made to the temple in Jerusalem. It may have been basically to accommodate the soldiers. They may have had to house soldiers from the Greco-Syrian Empire, and they may have used the Temple Mount, apparently, to house some of them. This caused changes to the temple. At this time, Menelaus is in charge, and his Hellenizing party, which we could call the radical reformers, they saw this is the beginning of the anti-Judaism laws. About this time, several laws were passed that forbade circumcision. You can't circumcise your boys anymore. You're forbidden from observing the Torah, the Jewish law. It may have been that even a pig was sacrificed on the altar in Jerusalem, in the Holy of Holies. And the temple was turned into a syncretistic Jewish pagan grove. You know, in traditional Greek religion and other religions, having a grove of trees is sort of considered the sacred area. It's like when you walk through a forest now and you come upon a nice open kind of grove of trees, and all of a sudden you just kind of feel like, you know, some nymph or something is going to jump out at you, and, you know, God is there. So the Greeks liked these sorts of groves of trees. So this is often what they would use as a sacred area. They did this to the temple, and it was renamed as a shrine to Zeus Olympus. Now, notice what's happened. I talked about syncretism last time. If you're one of these liberal Jews, you may not really believe you're doing anything bad. You're not forsaking Judaism. You're just updating it. You're just bringing it up in the modern era. And you might say, well, what's wrong with calling it Zeus Olympus? We all know these are just different names given to the same God anyway. There's just one supreme God. So they may well have identified the Jewish God Yahweh with this god Zeus Olympus and said it's just two different names, one Greek name and one Jewish name for the same Jewish God. That may have been what they were thinking about. They could also have been thinking about the Syrian god Baal. That Baal Shammam was a Syrian god. So they just think, well, we'll have an altar here. Antiochus will be happy because we're worshiping the Syrian god here. The Greeks are happy we're worshiping Zeus Olympus. And the Jews will be happy because it's identified as Yahweh. This whole process of Hellenization, therefore, I'm interpreting this. In a lot of history books, sometimes you'll get the idea that the Jews were all good, loyal Jews, just trying to keep the law, trying to keep Torah, and that the Antiochus IV Epiphanes is putting all this on them and forcing Greek religion and Greek culture on them. That's not really the way it happened. I've told the story